Good morning. My name is Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer. I am the Director of the Policy Innovation Hub at Griffith University. I'm so delighted and privileged to speak at this Gender and Disasters Conference in such esteemed company, with such an esteemed audience, and at this critical juncture in Australian history. Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me. First, I would like to acknowledge, as we always must, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, or on which I am recording this video, that of the Jagera and Turrbal people here in Meanjin, Brisbane. And also I would like to acknowledge the Kamilaroi people of the land where I was born in Coonabarabran. I pay my deepest respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I would like to pay my deepest respect to those Indigenous peoples present today, listening from Australia, New Zealand or around the world. So my topic this morning is to speak about the intersection between climate justice and gender equality, particularly in the context of increasing disasters in Australia. In particular, I will examine the questions: what are the gendered implications of climate change? How can we achieve a just transition in gender terms? What does climate justice even look like in our Australian context? And I use my own hometown of Coonabarabran in central West New South Wales as an example, hence my backdrop today of the Warrumbungle mountain range. Finally, one of the particular issues I'm interested in is the future of insurance in Australia, and I wonder what will become of the uninsured and the uninsurable. So let's start global. If I can paint you a general picture, we do have some emerging global mechanisms. We have the agenda action plan in the latest conference of the parties. And so in the lead up to COP26, there will be more inclusion of gender mainstreaming in the outcomes document. We also have, as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, a whole goal dedicated to gender equality and a goal dedicated to climate justice and climate action. But generally speaking, we don't have a lot in the way of hard law. We do have the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which I'll get to. All right, so let's think about what kind of gender issues arise in disasters. So we do know from the evidence of the last decade that women and children are significantly more likely than men to die during climate-related disasters. This is because of lack of access to information. Often they're in the home, they don't find out what's happening until too late. They wait for direction, they wear the wrong kinds of clothes to be able to flee. So we also know that women and children comprise up to 80% of those displaced by natural disasters. The link between your vulnerability to disaster and poverty is very clear. Women constitute more of the world's poor and are often directly dependent on threatened environmental resources as their primary source of food and income. And women don't often have the same access to other resources, and this is true in Australia as well, such as education, information, land and credit that would help them to respond to a changing climate. Climate change also worsens existing inequalities, for example, increasing gender-based violence and the possible exploitation of women and girls. So here is a fact I want to make sure I leave with you today. 140 million years of productivity are lost annually because of the hours that women and girls around the world spend using slower, polluting cooking methods. So I want you to just sit with that for a minute. 140 million years of productivity, of talent, of time. That's because more than 3 billion people worldwide rely on polluting energy sources such as wood, dung and charcoal for cooking. Almost 1 billion rely on kerosene lamps and other polluting devices to light their homes. The health implications of this are terrible, and women's safety is jeopardised in their increasingly difficult quest for fuel and water. My first job as a refugee lawyer in 1996 was as a volunteer for the United Nations High Commission for Refugees in the Dadaab camp on the Kenya-Somali border, where a German NGO called GTZ was trying to solve this complex chain of gendered violence, environmental destruction and unproductive time use by introducing solar cookers. These kinds of complex policy solutions need to accelerate at scale to deal with the ongoing climate impacts that we're starting to experience now. Here's another factor I want you to really think about in terms of gender and disasters. About 12 million more young girls under 16, were thought to have been married off as the frequency of natural disasters has increased. So that's our best estimation of the rapid increase in forced marriages around the world. So you might not automatically put those two facts together, increase in forced marriages and increase in natural disasters. But because of the gendered experience of natural disasters, that is a reality, that link is a reality. So just as the COVID-19 lockdowns exacerbated intimate partner and family violence, just as armed conflict does, we will need to learn quickly how climate disasters affect men and women, boys and girls differently. There are so many domains of work to be done in this feminist leadership space, creating gender responsive disaster plans, understanding the social policy impacts of climate change on the most vulnerable in the context of particular places, integrating social inclusion into climate change planning and budgeting processes. So let's now go on a journey to Coonabarabran. I'm a very unlikely person. I'm a human rights lawyer from Coonabarabran, and I've always been very heavily influenced by Eleanor Roosevelt. A quote she had when just after she'd finished being part of the drafting committee for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she said, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home. So close and so small, they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighbourhood he lives in, the school or college she attends, the farm, factory or office where they work. Such are the places where every man, woman and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere." So recently I've started thinking about the future of climate justice and the very difficult associated problems of mobility and adaptation. And I've realised that one way for me to explore these issues is by going home and posing a very simple yet very painful question. What would make the people of Coonabarabran walk away from the place that they live and the place that they love? And have they already started to leave? So I've written a piece for the Griffith Review that I will make available. It's put in my bio for the conference. So some of this is extracted from that. So I wrote that when I was growing up, I wanted Coonabarabran to be somewhere people had heard of, where exciting things happened. Life always seemed to happen elsewhere when I was a girl. But in January 2013, I heard the name of my birthplace on the news every hour of every day for almost 6 weeks. A ferocious bushfire caused the loss of over 56,000 hectares of land, 95% of the Warrumbungle National Park and 56 homes. 28 firefighters, some of those volunteers, were injured during those 41 days. That represented 41 days of waiting to see whether the wind would change, if containment lines around the town would hold. It felt like every journalist in Australia was on the radio mangling the name of our neighbouring little town of Bugaldye. The Prime Minister visited, all eyes were on Coonabarabran at last, and it was enough to break my heart. I lived in Canberra then, in the bubble, and I had just returned from a visit home to Coona with the kids. It's a long drive because Coona is a long drive from anywhere. It's 90 minutes from Dubbo, 2 hours from Tamworth. And I had been reflecting just how dry and how hot the Central West New South Wales region was looking, the driest I'd ever seen it. I knew about fire too, because I love Siding Springs Observatory, and because my husband is from Canberra. We'd been married at the sister observatory in Canberra called Mount Stromlo in December 2002. And a fortnight later, a roaring fire wiped out our wedding venue. at the observatory as we cowered in our suburb below. It was my first experience of a catastrophic bushfire, and it was really terrifying. I've never felt such primal, visceral fear. Go through it once and you'll always carry a knot of apprehension when the weather feels like it did on those days. And I know so many Australians now know what that feeling is like since the recent bushfires. I felt that sense of dread again. I let my mum know we'd made it safely back to Canberra, and she said there was a fire at Womblong, which is a camping ground in the park. No one was sure how it started, and no inquiry has ever found out what really happened. They thought it was lightning hitting Split Rock, but it was getting out of control. So fires are very uncommon in the Warrumbungles. That was noteworthy enough, but at that stage we were worried about the tourists in the park and the wildlife. But over the next few days it became clear this was no ordinary fire. By mid-January, Mum was reporting the Siding Spring Observatory was damaged, Bugle Dive was under serious threat, and properties had been lost. The fire was uncontained for 2 weeks. It was of exceptional ferocity. No matter what the firefighting experience thrown at it by people who'd been in the area for decades, it was not enough. My mother and stepfather owned the caravan park then, the John Oxley. For the duration of the fire, my mum looked after tents full of SES workers, and she housed evacuees with singed pets in the cabins. Everyone is crying, she said, even the tough old blokes. So years later, they're still trying to forget the terror of that fireball in the sky, the choking smoke, the arbitrary nature of a fire front that could destroy one house and leave the neighbour untouched, the speed of the fire's run, the livestock that had to be put down, the wildlife that was decimated. And as I said, I know that is a common feeling across this country. So as part of the bushfires in early 2020, Coona was in the news again. This time the fire was out of control in the Pilliga Scrub, very close to where my parents have now retired. But the fires weren't all Coona had to contend with. There'd been years before of severe water restrictions. The average daily consumption was limited to about 0.5 megalitres. Baths had to be no more than 30 centimetres deep, showers less than 5 minutes long. All the town's gardens were dead. People were operating off bore water. People were carting water to keep their indoor plants alive from their washing machines. None of the motels could fill their pools, even though it was incredibly hot. Fires have a long train. So the impact of the 2013 fire, which had a major impact on tourism in the park, meant that people had fewer resources in terms of money and networks. Some had moved away rather than rebuild, and anger remained over lack of compensation and underinsurance. Neither a coronial inquiry nor a New South Wales parliamentary inquiry had found negligence involved in the 2013 fire or the way it was fought. They found what the 2020 Bushfires Royal Commission is finding now. These fires were unprecedented, and we were unprepared for that. Coonabarabran people pride themselves on our resilience, but that resilience had been shaken. Everything felt more precarious. So my parents were evacuated twice during 2020, and my mother said 2 shattering things as she was evacuated for the second time. First, she was shared that people might not have the resources to go somewhere safe when they were evacuated at this point. And second, for the first time in 60 years of living in Coonabarabran, she and my stepdad thought they might have to leave the town, but they didn't know where was a safer place when so much of the nation was burning in places you'd never expect. So most Australians probably think of Pacific Islanders when they think of climate refugees. The region's people are already at the forefront of impacts of our changing climate, and we should be thinking about and acting in solidarity with our Pacific neighbours. But the issue is close to home. Sea level rise is affecting the Torres Strait Islands, and that should be front page news every day. Torres Strait Island elders have made a complaint to the UN Human Rights Committee, and I think they will succeed. But will it be too late? When will Australians have to move due to climate change, and on what terms? So in March 2020, the rains finally came to Central West New South Wales. The bores were switched off, and then the COVID pandemic hit. But this made living as far away from other humans as possible quite an attractive proposition. Mum made many jokes this last year that she'd been socially distancing all her life as a rural person. But of course, that stopped the tourists to the town. Some families did give up after the first round of fires. There was a lot of hurt and a lot of blame as the inquiries went on, and there was no compensation. So I wonder, will we look back on those families who gave up on Coonabarabran as part of the first wave of forced relocation that has happened due to climate change in Australia? Do Australians realise that climate mobility issues are already happening? But I have to tell you that in January 2020, it was obvious that there was no clear plan for what the Coonabarabran community should do if these things happened again. And this is a conversation that also deals with some of our most structural problems around reconciliation and acknowledgement of colonisation. So the 2020 bushfires were as unprecedented as the 2013 Coona bushfire was, and they've had a particular impact on First Nations peoples. In the wake of these events, there's increasing awareness of the specific climate mobility issues First Nations families face, not only in Coona. Communities have distinctive cultural connections to place and land and have already experienced all kinds of dislocation. So some of Coona's First Nations families were forced to come to Coonabarabran after being displaced already. This year, the Bushfire Royal Commission heard that 1 in 8 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia had already been directly impacted by the 2020 bushfires. It also heard that while Indigenous land management is critical to preventing catastrophic bushfires, Aboriginal voices have largely been ignored. It is clear that First Nations peoples hold distinct, diverse and spatially extensive legal rights and interests in land, including across much of the fire-affected areas. So how are we going to find a more inclusive and just outcome in this regard? So we can learn from the global picture here. People are on the move around the world. So we now know the United Nations now has evidence of a couple of different types of mobility driven by climatic changes, including migration in the ordinary way, forced displacement and planned relocations. It has also identified some of the reasons why people affected by the same stimuli do not always leave. In 2017 alone, 68.5 million people around the world were forcibly displaced, which is the largest number at any point in human history. About 1/3 of these were people who were forced to move by sudden onset weather events such as flooding, forest fires, droughts, or intensified storms. And I'm holding in my heart those folk in Western Australia being hit by that cyclone at the moment. So if you think about that, about 1/3 affected by sudden onset weather, that's around 24 million people, roughly the entire population of Australia, in 2017 alone. We know this is because sea levels are rising at the rate of roughly 12 millimetres a year in the Western Pacific. It's submerged 8 islands and 2 more are imminent. And we know how many Australians are still displaced by the 2019-2020 bushfires. We know there are Australians whose coastal homes have already been damaged or lost, and some have even fallen off cliffs after storms. So under the new Framework Convention for Climate Change, it is now accepted that climate change is a cause of human mobility, that human mobility is an adaptation strategy for climate change, and that all climate change policy should consider human mobility. We know that around the world there are trapped populations, people who do not have the resources, assets or networks to enable their migration. We also saw in the COVID-19 pandemic about how pandemic responses showed a kind of an X-ray of inequality in our society about people who were able to mitigate the consequences of the pandemic and those who couldn't. There are also voluntarily immobile populations who choose to remain where they are for reasons of place attachment, socio-cultural continuity and their values. So what we haven't seen in Australia is a public discussion about what this idea of climate mobility means for us. Will people have to leave their towns in Western Queensland for 6 months of the year or for cyclone season up north? Will some places become modern ghost towns? What about the storm season in Queensland? Will rising insurance premiums drive people away from towns like Mackay? What happens if those once in 100-year flood, fires and droughts hit every few years, as the data predicts? Who will help and who will have to help themselves? What is the role of government in these kinds of decisions? What kind of information do people need? Should people stop building houses so close to the coastline? I think about this in relation to the Gold Coast all the time, Noosa. Will some places run out of water so often that livelihoods are no longer possible? Water will be stored and evaporate differently as a result of climate change. So as an academic, as the girl least likely to end up a law professor, I'm shifting my human rights research to focus on climate justice close to home. When we adapt, as we must, to climate impacts, the actions we take must be fair, equitable and just. They must not leave behind the most vulnerable and the least powerful. All states have a human rights duty to protect men and women, girls and boys in all their diversity from the harmful effects of the climate crisis, including displacement. So what does that look like? What plans should governments and communities be making right now? What resources do we have and what resources do we need? These are fundamental climate justice questions. How do we define the burden of loss and damage when the risks often fall more heavily on those least able to reduce or recover from them? How will we understand and delineate the need for mobility and sanctuary due to displacement, both inside Australia and throughout our region from climate impacts? What are the ethical parameters for climate action and protest? And what does urban climate justice look like in terms of more than human cities versus climate justice in rural and remote areas? So this leads me to my final question. What becomes of the uninsurable? The term uninsurables, which I'm making a thing, it essentially refers to an emerging class of people who, due to changing patterns and frequencies in climate extremities, will eventually be unable to insure their homes from the effects of disasters, their lives and their property as well, I should say, including bushfires, coastal inundation, riverine flooding, extreme winds, soil subsidence caused by drought. As Australian women are generally poorer than men, especially in later life, I see this as an emerging gender crisis. And that is because of this key third factor I want you to remember. By the time they are 60, 30% of Australian women, single women in Australia, live in poverty. So the face of poverty in Australia is increasingly single women over 60. All right. According to climate scientist Carl Mellon, a property is effectively uninsurable when climate risks are so elevated that insurers refuse to offer coverage after a commercial calculation, or if the annual premium is priced at or above 1% of the cost to replace the property, it will become unaffordable for the average Australian. We already see this in some far north properties. The Australian Actuaries Climate Index indicates that the frequency and severity of climate disasters are escalating, prompting the fundamental question of what will happen to those unable to insure their housing and what this means for the Australian economy, federal and local governments, and for the future of the insurance industry. So we know from the Royal Commission that the recent bushfires meant the insurance industry lost over $2.31 billion to claims, with companies since ramping up insurance premiums across New South Wales and Victoria to meet increased risks. And I can only imagine what the recent floods are going to do to that calculation. And they're looking at postcode uninsurability. For example, what happens if the Blue Mountains becomes uninsurable as a postcode? Townsville premiums, for example, have risen by over 50% since their 2019 flooding and cyclone activity. So in the past, insurance companies have used a once in a 100-year rule to establish risk. However, by the year 2100, the risk of a 1 in a 100-year flood will have increased 130%, according to Moss and Burkett. And that's a wonderful article, a report that I'll also put in the chat by Jeremy Moss from UNSW. So Molson Burkett are saying that roughly 1 million houses in Australia will become unavailable or unaffordable for insurance, with 3/4 of these in densely populated urban cities, in what they call red spots, or as I said, red spot postcodes. And these property values will then start to plummet as they will become progressively unattractive to buyers. We saw this as a result of flood insurance in Brisbane as well, changing the landscape for a whole range of suburbs that were previously very desirable. So the question is, will this escalate to entire towns becoming abandoned, especially those who also are transitioning from fossil fuel activities, and others gradually becoming more expensive and overpopulated? You can be sure that very sophisticated property investment people are doing proper climate risk, although I'm always amazed that beachfront property on Byron Bay just never seems to reflect the reality of climate change. So reduced property prices in high-risk areas will affect low-income earners. This is where the gendered poverty issue comes in. So what will become of these uninsurables? So at the moment, we know that disaster coverage is contained to home and contents, total replacement or sum insured. And as we hear, if more and more homes become impossible to insure in terms of total replacement, it will become dependent on whether governments take action to address or mitigate climate risks, including local government, federal and state. So let's have a think about the prospect of Australians abandoning damaged properties, which is what I saw in Coonabarabran in 2013 aftermath. There are steps that can be taken to prevent increased future uninsurability issues. So we have to change the way we spend. 97% of federal funding is spent in response to a natural disaster, despite data showing that $1 spent on mitigation tends to reap a dividend of $5 in post-disaster damage. We know this from armed conflict prevention work that I've done as well. You have to invest in prevention, even though it's not as visually obvious to the voter why that's important. You have to make the political case for prevention of disasters. So disaster mitigation tools are increasingly important. Hazard reduction, dams, backflow devices, drainage systems. So if we think about Roma, Queensland, after a series of 4 floods over a 5-year period, the insurance companies were refusing to insure properties in that postcode. Roma's local council built a $16 million urban levy, which managed to reduce risks and improve locals' insurance premiums by 30% on average. Building codes and mandates, improved land use planning and future constructions should also reduce risk. Government-backed insurance programs are another way to adapt. And I think this is the way we have to go. The US National Flood Insurance Program after Hurricane Katrina and the Netherlands Government Flood Compensation Scheme are 2 good examples. So the insurance industry is really in a pickle. They are facing exceedingly volatile risks that are difficult to calculate. So I think that we have all got a duty to start thinking about our risk awareness for our lifestyle changes, even our professions. There'll be certain professions that work primarily outdoors and into particular types of, like the construction industry, that are also going to be affected. Or we might have to incorporate environmental factors into pricing for insurance. Whatever happens, we have to change the way we think. And we have to accept that some of our beloved places are no longer safe places to live. What I care about is that calculation is a calculation where people have some choice and control over the dignity of their lives. Thank you.